They called her just another college girl sitting in the back of Professor Martinez's aerodynamics lecture. But when Flight 447 lost both engines at 35,000 feet with 4 souls aboard, Sarah Phoenix Rodriguez had exactly 18 minutes to do what the Pentagon said was impossible: land a crippled F-18 Super Hornet on a carrier deck in the middle of a Category 3 hurricane. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous pilots are the ones everyone assumes are harmless. The mechanical pencil snapped between Sarah Rodriguez's fingers as she gripped it too tightly. The third one this week. She stared down at the broken graphite scattered across her fluid dynamics homework, equations blurring together as her hands began their familiar tremor. Around her, 20-year-olds chatted about weekend parties and spring break plans, their biggest worry being whether they'd pass their midterms. None of them knew that the quiet Latina girl in the faded jeans and university sweatshirt had once been Lieutenant Commander Sarah Rodriguez, the youngest pilot ever to qualify for carrier operations and the only woman to successfully complete the Navy's most classified aerial combat program. That was before Kandahar, before the mission that killed her wingman and left her with what the Navy doctors clinically termed acute stress reaction with motor function disruption. What they didn't put in their reports was how she woke up screaming every night, how the sound of jet engines made her break into a cold sweat, or how her hands shook so badly she couldn't hold a flight stick steady for more than 30 seconds. Sarah flexed her fingers, watching the slight tremor that had ended her career 18 months ago. The discharge papers had been processed with military efficiency, medical separation, honorable conditions, full benefits, and a recommendation for civilian flight training that everyone knew was a cruel joke. How could she fly commercial aircraft when she couldn't even drive her Honda Civic without her hands shaking on the steering wheel? The lecture hall at UC San Diego was a far cry from the ready rooms aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln. Professor Martinez droned on about lift coefficients and wing loading, concepts Sarah had mastered before most of these kids could drive. She'd learned aerodynamics not from textbooks, but from pushing F-18 Super Hornets to their absolute limits, feeling the aircraft respond to her touch like a living creature. Now she sat among teenagers taking notes on principles she'd lived and breathed for 8 years of active duty. Her phone buzzed against her leg. Sarah glanced at the display and felt her blood freeze. The number belonged to Admiral Patricia Hawkins, her former commanding officer aboard the Lincoln. In 18 months of civilian life, Sarah had received exactly 0 communications from her old unit. Retired military personnel weren't supposed to get emergency calls from active duty admirals. Sarah gathered her books quietly and slipped out of the lecture hall, ignoring the curious glances from her classmates. In the empty corridor, she answered the call with the instinctive bearing that 8 years of naval aviation had drilled into her bones. "Admiral Hawkins, ma'am." Her voice carried the crisp professionalism that never quite faded, even in civilian clothes. "Sarah." The Admiral's tone was different from what Sarah remembered. Less commanding officer, more desperate friend. "I need you to listen very carefully. We have a situation, and you're the only pilot with the specific qualifications we need. If you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest content." Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd heard those words before, right before they'd sent her to Afghanistan. Right before everything went wrong. "Ma'am, with respect, I'm a civilian now. Medical discharge, remember? Unfit for flight duties." "I remember everything about your service record, Lieutenant Commander." The use of her former rank sent a chill down Sarah's spine. In 18 months, Admiral Hawkins had never once used her military title, including the fact that you were the only pilot to successfully land an F-18 on a carrier deck in Sea State 6 conditions. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering that night in the North Atlantic. 30-foot swells, 40-knot crosswinds, and an aircraft with a compromised hydraulic system. The landing had been more prayer than precision, but she'd brought her bird home when 3 other pilots had to divert to land bases. It had earned her a commendation and a reputation as someone who could land anything, anywhere, under any conditions. "That was before," Sarah whispered, holding up her shaking hands even though the Admiral couldn't see them. "Ma'am, I can't hold a coffee cup steady, let alone fly a fighter aircraft." "Sarah, I need you to sit down." Admiral Hawkins' voice carried a weight that made Sarah's knees feel weak. 4 hours ago, a classified prototype aircraft experienced catastrophic engine failure during a test flight over the Pacific. The pilot and 3 engineers aboard are currently flying in a powerless aircraft at 35,000 feet, with approximately 6 hours of emergency battery power remaining. Sarah found herself sliding down the wall to sit on the cold linoleum floor. "What kind of aircraft?" "Modified F-18 Super Hornet, equipped with experimental avionics and flight control systems. The prototype was designed to test autonomous carrier landing capabilities in extreme weather conditions." Admiral Hawkins paused. "Sarah, they're flying directly into Hurricane Elena, Category 3 storm with sustained winds of 120 miles per hour. Jesus Christ." Sarah's mind automatically began calculating the impossible physics of the situation. A powerless aircraft in hurricane conditions would be like trying to control a leaf in a tornado. Where's the nearest airfield? That's the problem. The storm has shut down every possible landing site within their gliding range. The only option is carrier recovery, and Sarah ... Admiral Hawkins' voice broke slightly. "The USS Gerald Ford is the only carrier in position to attempt a recovery, and they're taking 40-foot seas in the middle of the hurricane." Sarah understood immediately why Admiral Hawkins had called her. Landing a powerless aircraft on a carrier deck was already considered impossible. Doing it in hurricane conditions was beyond impossible. It was suicide. But if anyone had ever successfully landed in conditions even remotely similar, it was Sarah Rodriguez. "Who's the pilot?" Sarah asked quietly. "Lieutenant Jake Morrison. 26 years old, graduated from Pensacola 18 months ago. He's good, Sarah, but he's never attempted a carrier landing in anything worse than moderate seas." Admiral Hawkins paused. "The 3 engineers with him are civilians. Dr. Emily Chen, the lead avionics designer, Mark Stevens, propulsion specialist, and Dr. David Kumar, who designed the experimental flight control systems." Sarah felt her chest tighten. Dr. Emily Chen was 28 years old, the same age as Sarah's younger sister Maria had been when she died in a car accident while Sarah was deployed. The parallel hit her like a physical blow. "Ma'am, even if I wanted to help, I'm not qualified anymore. Medical discharge means I can't fly military aircraft. Besides, I'm in San Diego. How could I possibly—" "Sarah, stop." Admiral Hawkins' voice carried the authority that had once commanded an entire carrier battle group. "The prototype aircraft has experimental remote piloting capabilities. We can establish a direct neural link between you and the aircraft's flight control systems. You would pilot the aircraft remotely while providing real-time guidance to Lieutenant Morrison." Sarah's head spun. Remote piloting technology had been theoretical when she left active duty. The idea that they could create a neural link allowing her to actually feel the aircraft's control responses while sitting hundreds of miles away seemed like science fiction. "The technology exists," Admiral Hawkins continued, as if reading Sarah's thoughts. "It was developed specifically for situations like this, where an experienced pilot needs to take control of an aircraft without physically being present. The system reads your neural impulses and translates them into control inputs, while providing you with complete sensory feedback from the aircraft." "And my condition? The tremor?" "The neural interface bypasses your motor functions entirely. It reads your intentions directly from your brain, not your physical movements. The tremor won't matter. Admiral Hawkins paused. Sarah, you're the only pilot alive with the specific experience needed for this recovery. No one else has ever successfully landed a fighter aircraft on a carrier in conditions even close to what they're facing. Sarah stood up, pacing the empty corridor as her mind raced through the implications. Remote piloting technology that could bypass her physical limitations. 4 lives hanging in the balance. And conditions that would challenge even her considerable skills. Where would I need to go? Miramar Air Station. We have a mobile command unit already en route to your location. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the lead developer of the neural interface system, is personally overseeing the setup. Admiral Hawkins' voice carried a note of hope for the first time. Sarah, I know what I'm asking. But those 4 people are going to die unless someone with your skills takes control of that aircraft. Sarah thought about Lieutenant Morrison, barely older than the college students she sat next to every day. She thought about Dr. Chun, probably brilliant and dedicated like Maria had been. She thought about the 2 other engineers who were probably terrified out of their minds, watching their altitude slowly decrease as their powerless aircraft flew into the worst storm in a decade. How long do I have to decide? The aircraft has approximately 5 hours and 40 minutes of battery power remaining. We need you at Miramar within the next 2 hours to complete the neural interface calibration process. Admiral Hawkins paused. Sarah, I'm not going to lie to you. Even with your skills, even with this technology, the probability of a successful recovery is extremely low. But without you, it's 0. Sarah closed her eyes and made the decision that would change everything. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Outstanding. Sarah, there's one more thing you should know. Admiral Hawkins' voice carried a warning tone. The prototype aircraft contains classified technology that certain foreign governments would kill. To obtain, we have intelligence suggesting that hostile forces are tracking the aircraft's emergency beacon. This rescue operation may not be as straightforward as it appears. Sarah felt a familiar chill run down her spine. In her experience, military operations that seemed complicated always turned out to be impossibly complex. What kind of hostile forces? Unknown at this time. But Sarah, if this is a setup, if someone is using those 4 lives as bait to draw out our most advanced pilots in technology... Admiral Hawkins let the implication hang in the air. Then I'm walking into another trap. Sarah finished the thought. That had been haunting her since Kandahar. Just like last time. Maybe, but Sarah, if you don't try, those 4 people are definitely going to die. And if hostile forces do capture that prototype aircraft, the technology they gain could compromise every carrier operation we conduct for the next 20 years. Sarah looked down at her shaking hands, then at her college textbooks scattered on the floor. 80 months ago, she'd been one of the Navy's most elite pilots. Now she was a 29-year-old college student trying to convince herself that a degree in aerospace engineering could somehow replace the identity she'd lost when her career ended. But 4 people were going to die unless she remembered who she used to be. And maybe, just maybe, the neural interface technology could give her back the one thing she'd lost when her hands started shaking, the ability to fly. Admiral, send me the technical specifications for the neural interface system. I'll meet your team at Miramar. Sarah gathered her books, her hands steady for the first time in 18 months. And ma'am, you'd better pray this technology works. Because landing a powerless aircraft on a carrier deck in hurricane conditions is going to require a miracle. Sarah, you've always been our miracle worker. Time to prove it one more time. The call ended, leaving Sarah alone in the empty corridor with the weight of 4 lives settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. She looked down at her fluid dynamics homework, equations that had seemed so important 30 minutes ago, now appearing trivial compared to the real-world physics problem she was about to face. Sarah Rodriguez had spent 18 months trying to convince herself she was just another college student. In 2 hours, she would discover whether the pilot who had once been called Phoenix could rise from the ashes of her broken career one more time. The tremor in her hands had stopped entirely. The drive to Miramar Air Station took 28 minutes through San Diego traffic that seemed to crawl despite Sarah's urgent need to arrive. Her Honda Civic felt foreign after years of military vehicles, but the base access procedures remained burned into her muscle memory. The guard at the main gate studied her expired military ID with professional skepticism until Admiral Hawkins' authorization code appeared on his computer screen. "Welcome back to Miramar, Lieutenant Commander," the young Marine said, snapping to attention with a precision that reminded Sarah of her own younger self. "Hangar 7 is expecting you." Sarah drove through the familiar base layout, past rows of F-18 Super Hornets that gleamed under the California sun. Each aircraft represented millions of dollars of precision engineering and hundreds of hours of pilot training. Seeing them again after 18 months felt like encountering old friends who might not recognize her anymore. The pilots conducting pre-flight inspections moved with the confident swagger she remembered, their flight suits crisp and their bearing unmistakably military. Hangar 7 sat apart from the main flight line, surrounded by security barriers and electronic countermeasure equipment that hadn't been there during Sarah's active duty years. Military police in full combat gear checked her identification again before allowing her vehicle to approach the massive structure. Whatever was happening inside required security clearances far above her former pay grade. Dr. Jennifer Walsh met Sarah at the hangar entrance, her appearance striking in its contrast to the military personnel surrounding them. Where the others wore uniforms and carried themselves with martial bearing, Dr. Walsh looked like she'd stepped out of a university laboratory. Wire-rimmed glasses, auburn hair pulled back in a functional ponytail, and a white lab coat covered in coffee stains and technical diagrams. But her eyes held an intensity that reminded Sarah of the most dedicated pilots she'd served with. "Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, I presume?" Dr. Walsh extended a hand that was surprisingly strong for someone who spent her time working with computers rather than aircraft. "I've been reading your service record. That landing you made in the North Atlantic 3 years ago was genuinely impressive from a physics standpoint." "Just Sarah now, Doctor. And thank you, though I'm not sure impressive is the word I'd use for barely controlled chaos." Sarah glanced toward the hangar interior, where she could see banks of computer equipment and several technicians in civilian clothes working with urgent efficiency. "Admiral Hawkins mentioned you've developed technology that can bypass motor function limitations." Dr. Walsh's expression grew serious as she led Sarah into the hangar. The Neural Flight Interface System, or NFIS, represents a complete paradigm shift in aviation control systems. Instead of relying on physical manipulation of flight controls, the system reads your neural impulses directly and translates them into aircraft commands. Essentially, you think about turning left, and the aircraft turns left. The interior of Hangar 7 had been transformed into something between a command center and a medical facility. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens displaying real-time data streams that Sarah recognized as aircraft telemetry. In the center of the space sat a chair that looked more like something from a space program than a pilot's seat, surrounded by monitoring equipment and a helmet covered in sensors and fiber optic cables. The prototype aircraft, designated X-47C, is currently at 33,000 feet and descending slowly. Dr. Walsh continued, pointing to a large display screen showing the aircraft's position relative to Hurricane Elena. "Lieutenant Morrison and his passengers have approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes of battery power remaining before complete electrical failure." Sarah studied the weather data scrolling across multiple monitors. Hurricane Elena was a textbook Example of nature's fury, with a clearly defined eye wall and rotation patterns that would create wind shears capable of tearing apart even the most robust aircraft. The storm's movement patterns showed it tracking directly toward the USS Gerald Ford's position, meaning the carrier would be taking the full brunt of the hurricane during any attempted recovery. Dr. Walsh, I need to understand exactly how this neural interface works, Sarah said, approaching the pilot's chair with professional caution. In my experience, technology that sounds too good to be true usually has limitations that become apparent at the worst possible moments. Dr. Walsh nodded approvingly. Healthy skepticism. The NFIS works by reading electrical impulses from your motor cortex, the part of your brain that controls voluntary muscle movement. When you think about moving your hand to adjust flight controls, your brain generates specific electrical patterns. Our system intercepts those patterns before they reach your muscles and translates them into digital commands for the aircraft. And the feedback? How do I know what the aircraft is doing? Sarah examined the helmet's sensor array, noting the sophisticated electronics that would interface directly with her nervous system. Complete sensory integration. The system feeds aircraft response data directly into your nervous system, creating the sensation that you're actually sitting in the cockpit. You'll feel the aircraft's movement, sense changes in attitude and airspeed, even experience G-forces through vestibular stimulation. Dr. Walsh paused. It's remarkably similar to actually flying, except your physical limitations don't factor into the equation. Admiral Hawkins emerged from a secure communications area, her expression grim as she approached Sarah and Dr. Walsh. I've just received updated intelligence about our situation. The news isn't good. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. In military operations, bad news had a tendency to cascade into worse news with alarming speed. What kind of complications are we looking at, Admiral? 3 Chinese destroyers have altered course and are moving toward the X-47C's projected flight path. Additionally, we've detected submarine activity in the area that doesn't match any scheduled operations. Admiral Hawkins pulled up a tactical display showing ship positions around Hurricane Elena. Someone is very interested in that prototype aircraft. Dr. Walsh removed her glasses and cleaned them nervously. Admiral, if hostile forces are planning to intercept the aircraft, wouldn't it be safer to attempt a water landing rather than risk a carrier recovery? The X-47C contains technology that cannot fall into foreign hands under any circumstances, Admiral Hawkins replied. The experimental flight control systems alone represent 20 years of research and development. If we lose that aircraft to hostile forces, we compromise every advanced aviation program currently in development. Sarah studied the tactical display, her mind automatically calculating intercept courses and timing windows. So we're not just conducting a rescue operation. We're also trying to prevent the prototype from being captured by potentially hostile forces while flying into a Category 3 hurricane. That's correct. And Sarah, there's something else you need to know about Lieutenant Morrison. Admiral Hawkins pulled up a personnel file on one of the computer screens. He's Admiral Thomas Morrison's son. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Admiral Thomas Morrison had been her mentor during flight training, the officer who'd recommended her for advanced combat programs and supported her career advancement through 8 years of service. He'd also been the one to sign her medical discharge papers when her condition made continued flight duties impossible. Admiral Morrison specifically requested that we contact you for this operation, Admiral Hawkins continued. He believes you're the only pilot with the skills necessary to bring his son home safely. Sarah felt the weight of personal obligation settling alongside professional duty. Admiral Morrison had risked his own career advancement by supporting a young female pilot in programs traditionally dominated by men. If his son died because she couldn't overcome her limitations, it would be a betrayal of everything he'd invested in her development. Dr. Walsh, how long does the neural interface calibration process take? Sarah asked, moving toward the pilot's chair with renewed determination. Approximately 90 minutes for full system integration and testing. We need to map your specific neural patterns and calibrate the feedback systems to match your sensory preferences. Dr. Walsh began powering up the monitoring equipment. Sarah, I should warn you that some pilots experience disorientation during the initial connection. The sensation of controlling an aircraft without physical input can be psychologically challenging. Sarah settled into the pilot's chair, which adjusted automatically to accommodate her body dimensions. The sensor-covered helmet felt heavier than any flight gear she'd worn during active duty, but the weight was reassuring in its solidity. Doctor, I've been psychologically challenged since Kandahar. Controlling an aircraft through thought patterns can't be worse than watching my wingman die while my hands shake too badly to help him. Dr. Walsh and her technicians began attaching sensors to Sarah's arms and chest, monitoring equipment that would track her vital signs during the neural interface process. The helmet's interior contained dozens of contact points that would read electrical activity from her brain, creating a complete map of her motor control patterns. Beginning neural mapping sequence, Dr. Walsh announced, activating the primary systems. Sarah, I want you to think about standard flight control inputs. Imagine pulling back on the stick to climb, pushing forward to descend, rolling left and right for turns. Sarah closed her eyes and let her mind drift back to countless hours in F-18 cockpits, feeling the responsive touch of flight controls that had once been as natural as breathing. The neural interface system hummed quietly as it recorded the electrical patterns associated with each imagined movement, building a digital profile of her flight control instincts. Excellent neural pathway clarity, one of the technicians reported. Her motor cortex patterns are remarkably well defined, probably from years of repetitive flight training. Now for the feedback integration, Dr. Walsh said, adjusting controls on the main console. Sarah, you should begin feeling sensations that correspond to aircraft movement. Sarah's eyes flew open as she suddenly felt herself climbing through thin air, her inner ear responding to altitude changes that weren't actually happening. The sensation was so realistic that she instinctively gripped the chair's armrests, her body preparing for G-forces that existed only in the computer simulation. Holy shit, she breathed, then caught herself using inappropriate language in front of senior officers. I mean, that's remarkably realistic, Doctor. Dr. Walsh smiled. The first time is always surprising. Your brain is receiving the same sensory input it would get from actual flight, but processed through digital intermediaries instead of physical aircraft movement. For the next hour, Sarah worked with the neural interface system, learning to control a simulated F-18 through thought alone. The technology responded to her intentions with precision that exceeded anything she'd experienced with physical flight controls. When she thought about banking left, the simulated aircraft responded instantly. When she imagined reducing throttle, engine power decreased exactly as intended. This is incredible, Sarah said during a brief calibration break. It's like the aircraft is reading my mind. In a very real sense it is, Dr. Walsh replied. The system learns your specific neural patterns and adapts to your individual flying style. After this calibration process, the X-47C will respond to your thoughts as if they were direct control inputs. Admiral Hawkins approached the pilot's chair, her expression showing cautious optimism. Sarah, how do you feel about your ability to control the aircraft remotely? Sarah considered the question carefully. The neural interface technology was remarkable, but she was about to attempt something that had never been done before, landing a powerless aircraft on a carrier deck in hurricane conditions while sitting hundreds of miles away from the actual aircraft. I feel like we're about to find out whether this technology works under the most challenging conditions imaginable. That's what I was hoping you'd say, Admiral Hawkins replied. Because Lieutenant Morrison just reported that the X-47C has lost its backup electrical systems. They now have less than 3 hours of battery power remaining. The neural interface helmet felt cold against Sarah's scalp as Dr. Walsh made final adjustments to the sensor array. Through the hangar's open doors, Sarah could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, Hurricane Elena's outer bands reaching toward the California coast like grasping fingers. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to fly into the same type of weather system that was threatening her current location. Neural connection established, Dr. Walsh announced, her voice taking on the clinical precision of someone managing a complex technical procedure. Sarah, you should begin receiving telemetry data from the X-47C in approximately 30 seconds. Sarah closed her eyes and felt her consciousness expand beyond the confines of Hangar 7. Suddenly, she was floating 31,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by towering thunderheads that stretched from sea level to the stratosphere. The sensation was disorienting and exhilarating simultaneously, like stepping outside her own body while retaining complete awareness of her surroundings. The X-47C's cockpit materialized around her perception, every instrument and control surface as vivid as if she were physically present. Lieutenant Jake Morrison sat in the pilot's seat, his face pale with exhaustion and stress. Behind him, 3 civilian engineers huddled together, their academic confidence replaced by the stark reality of their mortality. Dr. Emily Chun was reviewing technical manuals with the desperate intensity of someone looking for a miracle in equations and diagrams. Lieutenant Morrison, this is Commander Rodriguez, Sarah transmitted through the aircraft's communication system. I'm establishing remote pilot authority for your aircraft. Can you hear me clearly? Morrison's head snapped up, his eyes searching the cockpit as if expecting to see her materialize in the co-pilot's seat. Commander, your voice is coming through our internal communications, but I don't show any other aircraft in the area. How are you transmitting? Classified technology. Lieutenant, what I need you to understand is that I'm going to be controlling your aircraft remotely while providing guidance for emergency procedures. Sarah felt the X-47C's flight surfaces respond to her mental commands, a subtle adjustment to the elevators that Morrison wouldn't have noticed. I want you to keep your hands near the controls, but don't interfere unless I specifically request your input. Through the neural interface, Sarah could feel every aspect of the aircraft's condition. The engines were completely dead, their turbine blades windmilling uselessly in the slipstream. The aircraft's electrical systems were operating on battery power alone, with critical systems being automatically shut down to conserve energy. Most concerning was the gradual loss of altitude as the aircraft's glide ratio slowly degraded without engine thrust. Dr. Emily Chun's voice came through the intercom, tight with barely controlled fear. Commander, our battery power is decreasing faster than projected. The experimental avionics systems are drawing more current than anticipated. Sarah reviewed the power consumption data flowing through the neural interface. The prototype's advanced flight control computers were indeed using excessive electrical power, but shutting them down would make the aircraft nearly impossible to control. Dr. Chun, can we reduce power consumption without compromising flight? Control authority? Negative, Commander. The experimental systems are integrated with basic flight controls. If we shut them down, we lose computer-assisted stability augmentation. Dr. Chun paused, her voice breaking slightly. Without engine power, this aircraft becomes aerodynamically unstable. The experimental flight control systems are the only thing keeping us airborne. Sarah felt a familiar chill as the full scope of their predicament became clear. The X-47C wasn't just a powerless aircraft gliding toward the ocean. It was an inherently unstable experimental prototype that required constant computer intervention to remain controllable. If the batteries died before they reached the carrier, The aircraft would become unflyable, and all 4 occupants would die in the resulting crash. Lieutenant Morrison, I need you to give me a complete status report on all aircraft systems. Sarah commanded, her mental focus shifting between multiple information streams flowing through the neural interface. Morrison began reading from his instrument panel with the mechanical precision of a pilot trained to function under extreme stress. Hydraulic pressure nominal, backup battery power at 63%, flight control computer systems operational, navigation systems functional, emergency locator beacon active. The mention of the emergency beacon triggered a warning in Sarah's tactical awareness. If hostile forces were indeed tracking the X-47C, the beacon was providing them with exact position coordinates updated every 30 seconds. Lieutenant, I need you to shut down the emergency locator beacon immediately. Commander, regulations require the beacon to remain active during emergency situations. Morrison replied, his training conflicting with the unusual order. Lieutenant, this is a direct order from remote pilot authority. Shut down the beacon. Now. Sarah's voice carried the unmistakable tone of command authority that 8 years of military service had burned into her. Vocal patterns. Morrison hesitated for only a moment before reaching for the beacon control switch. Emergency locator beacon disabled, Commander. Through the neural interface, Sarah could feel the aircraft's position relative to Hurricane Elena's massive circulation. They were flying directly toward the storm's northeastern quadrant, where wind speeds would exceed 140 miles per hour and updrafts could exceed 8,000 feet per minute. No aircraft had ever successfully navigated through hurricane conditions without engine power. Admiral Hawkins' voice crackled through the communication system from Miramar. Sarah, we've received updated weather data from the USS Gerald Ford. They're reporting wave heights of 45 feet and sustained winds of 115 miles per hour. The flight deck is experiencing vertical movement of plus or minus 20 feet every 12 seconds. Sarah processed this information while simultaneously monitoring the X-47C's gradually decreasing altitude. Landing on a carrier deck under normal conditions required precise timing and perfect aircraft control. Attempting the same landing on a deck that was moving through a 45-foot vertical range while being battered by hurricane-force winds was beyond the limits of conventional aviation. Admiral, what's the Ford's current position relative to the hurricane's eye wall? Sarah asked, her mental attention divided between multiple data streams. They're maintaining position approximately 15 miles northeast of the eye, trying to stay in the most stable weather conditions available. Admiral Hawkins paused. Sarah, Captain Williams aboard the Ford is recommending that we abort the carrier recovery attempt. He believes the conditions are too dangerous for any aircraft operation. Through the neural interface, Sarah could feel Lieutenant Morrison's tension increasing as he overheard the conversation. Behind him, the 3 civilian engineers exchanged glances that conveyed their growing understanding that rescue might not be possible. Admiral, what are our alternatives? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from studying the tactical situation. Water landing in hurricane conditions with approximately 0 survival probability, or ... Admiral Hawkins hesitated. We could attempt to guide the aircraft to Chinese territorial waters where their ships could attempt a rescue. The implication was clear. Surrendering the X-47C to Chinese forces would save the 4 lives aboard, but compromise decades of classified military aviation development. The technology contained in the prototype aircraft would give foreign governments insights into every advanced military aviation program currently under development. Sarah thought about Admiral Morrison's son, sitting in the pilot's seat of a powerless aircraft flying into the worst storm of the decade. She thought about Dr. Emily Chen, whose brilliant mind might hold the key to the next generation of aviation technology. She thought about the 2 other engineers whose only crime had been accepting assignment to a routine test flight. Admiral, "I need to speak with Admiral Morrison directly," Sarah said, her decision crystallizing as she weighed the lives of 4 people against national security implications. "Sarah, Admiral Morrison is in Washington attending emergency briefings about this situation. He specifically asked that you be given complete operational authority." Sarah felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders, like a familiar burden she'd carried throughout her military career. Admiral Morrison was entrusting her with his son's life while simultaneously giving her the authority to make decisions that could affect national security for decades. Through the neural interface, she could feel the X-47C entering the outer bands of Hurricane Elena. Turbulence began buffeting the aircraft as wind shears exceeded anything the powerless plane could effectively navigate. The ride became violent enough that she could hear Dr. Chun and the other engineers struggling against their safety restraints. "Lieutenant Morrison, we're about to enter severe turbulence," Sarah transmitted. "I want everyone secured in crash positions until we clear the worst of the storm." "Commander, are we still attempting carrier recovery?" Morrison asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Sarah made the decision that would determine whether 4 people lived or died. "In the next 2 hours." "Affirmative, Lieutenant. We're going to land on the Ford's deck, regardless of conditions." The X-47C shuddered as hurricane force winds seized control of the aircraft's destiny. The neural interface transmitted every violent shake and shudder as Hurricane Elena's outer winds grabbed the X-47C like a giant's fist. Sarah's consciousness rode inside the powerless aircraft while her physical body remained strapped into the pilot's chair at Miramar, creating a disorienting sensation of being in 2 places simultaneously. Through the prototype sensors, she could feel wind gusts exceeding 90 miles per hour hammering the aircraft from multiple directions, each impact threatening to tear the experimental flight surfaces apart. Dr. Walsh monitored Sarah's vital signs from the control console, watching as her heart rate and blood pressure spiked in response to the turbulence being transmitted through the neural link. "Sarah, your stress indicators are approaching dangerous levels. The system is designed to filter out excessive sensory input." "Negative," Sarah replied through gritted teeth, her mental focus locked on maintaining aircraft control as hurricane winds tried to flip the X-47C inverted. "I need full sensory input to understand what the aircraft is experiencing. If you filter the data, I lose the ability to anticipate control responses." Inside the X-47C's cockpit, Lieutenant Morrison gripped his seat restraints as the aircraft pitched and rolled through angles that would have been impossible with engine power. Behind him, Dr. Emily Chun had stopped reviewing technical manuals and was instead focused on the basic act of breathing as G-forces threw her against her safety harness. The 2 other engineers, Mark Stevens and Dr. David Kumar, had turned pale, green as motion sickness combined with terror to push their bodies beyond normal stress responses. "Commander, I'm reading structural stress indicators approaching redline limits," Morrison reported, his voice strained as he fought against the turbulence. The airframe wasn't designed for this level of punishment. Sarah could feel the aircraft's titanium and carbon fiber structure flexing under loads that exceeded design specifications. The X-47C had been built for precision flight testing, not hurricane survival, and every rivet and weld joint was being tested beyond its intended limits. Through the neural interface, she sensed microfractures developing in the wing root attachments, stress concentrations that could lead to catastrophic structural failure. "Dr. Kumar," Sarah transmitted to the propulsion specialist, "I need you to access the experimental flight control diagnostics. Can the computer systems compensate for structural flexibility in the wing attachments?" Kumar's voice came back shaky but professional. "Commander, the adaptive control algorithms can adjust for minor structural variations, but we're experiencing deformation patterns that exceed the software's compensation range." Sarah processed this information while simultaneously fighting to keep the aircraft from entering an unrecoverable spin. The X-47C's experimental flight control systems were sophisticated enough to maintain stability under normal conditions, but Hurricane Elena was creating aerodynamic forces that no computer algorithm had been designed to handle. Admiral Hawkins' voice crackled through the communication system from Miramar. "Sarah, we're receiving emergency signals from 3 different aircraft in your vicinity. It appears that Chinese and Russian reconnaissance planes are attempting to track the X-47C's position despite the emergency beacon shutdown." The tactical implications hit Sarah immediately. Foreign intelligence services were using their own aircraft to monitor the X-47C's progress through the hurricane, positioning themselves to intercept the prototype if it survived long enough to attempt a water landing. The presence of multiple foreign aircraft also meant that rescue options were becoming increasingly limited. "Admiral, are our forces in position to prevent intercept attempts?" Sarah asked while mentally commanding the X-47C through a series of violent wind shears that threatened to tear the wings off. The USS Gerald Ford has launched 2 F-18 Super Hornets as combat air patrol, but they're operating at the absolute limits of safety in these weather conditions, Admiral Hawkins replied. Captain Williams reports that flight operations are barely possible even for aircraft with full engine power. Through the neural interface, Sarah could sense the Ford's position approximately 60 miles ahead of the X-47C's current flight path. The carrier was fighting its own battle against Hurricane Elena, taking massive waves over the flight deck while struggling to maintain heading into the wind. The ship's air traffic control systems were operating on backup power after the primary radar array was damaged by flying debris. Dr. Walsh approached Sarah's chair with a tablet displaying the X-47C's power consumption analysis. "Sarah, I need you to understand that the aircraft's battery reserves are depleting faster than our worst-case projections. At current consumption rates, you have approximately 90 minutes of flight control authority remaining." Sarah felt her stomach clench as the implications became clear. 90 minutes would barely be enough time to reach the Ford's position, let alone execute the complex approach procedures required for a carrier landing. If the batteries died while they were still airborne, the X-47C would become a 40,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic stability of a brick. "Dr. Chen," Sarah transmitted to the avionics specialist aboard the X-47C, "can we reduce power consumption by shutting down non-essential systems?" Chun's voice came back tense with concentration. "Commander, I've already isolated everything except flight controls, navigation, and life support. The experimental processors are integrated with basic aircraft systems. If we shut down anything else, we lose the ability to maintain controlled flight." Sarah made a command decision that would either save precious battery power or doom all 4 occupants. "Dr. Chun, shut down the cabin environmental systems. We can survive on emergency oxygen, but we can't survive without flight controls." "Commander, that will reduce cabin temperature to approximately -20 degrees Fahrenheit at our current altitude," Chun replied. "Without environmental controls, we risk hypothermia and oxygen system failure. Do it anyway. We need every amp of battery power for flight controls." Sarah's mental focus remained locked on the aircraft's control surfaces as hurricane winds continued their relentless assault. The temperature inside the X-47C's cockpit began dropping immediately as the environmental systems shut down. Frost started forming on the interior surfaces while the 4 occupants huddled deeper into their flight suits. Emergency oxygen masks deployed automatically, providing breathable air while the cabin pressure slowly equalized with the outside atmosphere. Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through the intercom, now slightly muffled by his oxygen mask. "Commander, we're starting to experience ice formation on the control surfaces. The aircraft's response characteristics are changing." Sarah could feel the ice accumulation through the neural interface, a gradual degradation of the X-47C's aerodynamic efficiency that made control inputs less effective. Ice formation on the wings and tail surfaces would eventually make the aircraft uncontrollable, regardless of battery power or pilot skill. Lieutenant, activate the anti-ice systems for 30 seconds, then shut them down to conserve power, Sarah commanded. We'll cycle them periodically to prevent excessive buildup. The anti-ice systems drew massive amounts of electrical current, instantly dropping the battery reserves by another 2%. Sarah realized they were caught in an impossible equation. They needed power for flight controls, power for ice protection, and power for navigation systems, but the batteries contained only enough energy for 2 of the 3 requirements. Dr. Walsh's voice came through Sarah's helmet communicator. Sarah, Admiral Morrison is requesting a direct conference call. He wants to speak with you about his son's situation. Sarah felt her chest tighten at the thought of talking to her former mentor while his son flew through a hurricane in a powerless aircraft. Admiral Morrison had been like a father to her during her early career, and the thought of explaining that she might not be able to save Jake Morrison was almost unbearable. Put him through, Sarah said, steeling herself for the most difficult conversation of her military career. Admiral Morrison's voice came through the communication system, steady and professional despite the personal stakes. Sarah, I want you to know that Jake volunteered for this test flight specifically because he knew the risks involved. He's a good pilot, and he trusts your judgment completely. Admiral, I'm going to bring your son home, Sarah replied, her voice carrying a conviction she didn't entirely feel. I know you will, Sarah, but if the situation becomes impossible, if the choice comes down to the aircraft's technology or the lives aboard. Admiral Morrison paused. Save the people, Sarah. The technology can be rebuilt. The weight of that authorization settled on Sarah's shoulders as Hurricane Elena continued its relentless assault on the X-47C. If you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest content. The USS Gerald Ford appeared on the X-47C's radar scope as a tiny blip fighting for survival against Hurricane Elena's fury. Through the neural interface, Sarah could see the massive aircraft carrier pitching through wave heights that dwarfed the 1,100-foot vessel, its flight deck disappearing and reappearing as green water crashed over the bow. The ship's superstructure was barely visible through horizontal rain that reduced visibility to less than a quarter mile. Ford Tower, this is X-47C requesting emergency landing clearance, Lieutenant Morrison transmitted, his voice steady despite the circumstances. We have 4 souls on board, no engine power, and approximately 70 minutes of battery reserves remaining. The response from the Ford's air traffic control came back immediately, the controller's voice tight with stress. X-47C, Ford Tower, negative on landing clearance. Flight deck is currently experiencing plus or minus 30 feet of vertical movement every 8 seconds. All flight operations have been suspended due to extreme weather conditions. Sarah felt her heart sink as she processed the tactical situation through the neural interface. The Ford's flight deck was designed to handle aircraft operations in rough seas, but Hurricane Elena was creating conditions that exceeded every safety parameter established for carrier operations. Landing a powerless aircraft on a deck that was moving through a 60-foot vertical range while being hammered by 120-mile-per-hour winds was beyond the realm of possibility. Admiral Hawkins' voice crackled through the communication system from Miramar. Sarah, Captain Williams aboard the Ford is reporting that they've lost 2 aircraft over the side due to deck movement. The hurricane is creating wave action that's breaking the restraining cables. Through the neural interface, Sarah could feel the X-47C being buffeted by wind shears that change direction every few seconds. The aircraft's flight control computers were working at maximum capacity just to maintain controlled flight. with the experimental processors consuming battery power at an alarming rate. Ice continued to accumulate on the wing surfaces, despite periodic activation of the anti-ice systems. Dr. Emily Chun's voice came through the intercom, her scientific objectivity cracking under the stress of the situation. "Commander, I'm monitoring the battery systems from my engineering station. At current power consumption rates, we have 58 minutes before complete electrical failure." Sarah made rapid calculations in her mind, comparing their distance from the Ford with their rate of descent and remaining battery life. The mathematics were brutally simple. They would reach the carrier's position with approximately 20 minutes of power remaining, assuming the batteries didn't fail earlier due to cold weather degradation. "Dr. Kumar," Sarah transmitted to the propulsion specialist, "can the battery systems handle the power surge required for a carrier landing approach? The arresting gear engagement will put massive stress on the aircraft's electrical systems." Kumar's voice came back shaky but professional. "Commander, the batteries are already operating at their thermal limits. A high current power draw during landing could cause complete system failure at the worst possible moment." Sarah felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her consciousness. Every option led to scenarios that seemed beyond the limits of survival. Landing on the Ford's deck in hurricane conditions was essentially impossible. Water landing in 40-foot seas would be fatal for all occupants. Flying toward Chinese territorial waters would compromise decades of classified military technology. "Lieutenant." Morrison's voice broke through her tactical analysis. "Commander, I'm receiving radio transmissions from multiple aircraft in our vicinity. It sounds like Chinese and Russian reconnaissance planes are coordinating their positions to intercept us if we attempt a water landing." The presence of foreign aircraft confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the mission's complexity. The X-47C had become the center of an international incident, with foreign intelligence services positioning themselves to capture the prototype aircraft regardless of the fate of its occupants. "Lieutenant, can you identify the types of aircraft tracking us?" Sarah asked while simultaneously fighting to maintain control as hurricane winds tried to flip the X-47C inverted. Morrison consulted his radar display, noting contact signatures that appeared and disappeared as weather interference disrupted the detection systems. "I'm seeing intermittent contacts consistent with Chinese J-20 fighters and what might be Russian Su-57s. They're maintaining standoff distances but clearly monitoring our position." Sarah realized that the foreign aircraft were waiting for the X-47C to either crash or attempt a water landing, at which point they would move in to recover the wreckage before American forces could respond. The presence of advanced fighter aircraft also meant that any rescue attempts by U.S. forces would risk triggering an international incident. "Admiral." Hawkins' voice came through the communication system with new intelligence that changed everything. "Sarah, we've intercepted communications indicating that Chinese naval forces have submarine assets positioned along your flight path. If you attempt a water landing, they're prepared to recover the aircraft before our rescue forces can respond." The tactical picture was becoming impossibly complex. Sarah was piloting a powerless experimental aircraft through hurricane conditions, while foreign military forces positioned themselves to capture American technology. The 4 lives aboard the X-47C had become secondary to a larger geopolitical chess game. Dr. Walsh approached Sarah's neural interface chair with updated weather data from the Ford. "Sarah, Captain Williams is reporting a temporary reduction in wave height as the hurricane's eye wall approaches their position. They might have a 10-minute window where flight operations could theoretically be possible." Sarah processed this information while feeling the X-47C's structure groaning under aerodynamic loads that exceeded design specifications. The eye wall passage would create a brief period of relative calm, but it would also bring the most violent winds of the entire hurricane. Any aircraft attempting to land during the eye-wall passage would face wind speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour. "Admiral, what's the timing on the eye-wall passage over the Ford's position?" Sarah asked, her mental focus divided between aircraft control and tactical planning. "Approximately 45 minutes from now," Admiral Hawkins replied. "But Sarah, Captain Williams is strongly advising against any landing attempts during the eye-wall passage. The wind conditions would be beyond anything ever attempted in carrier aviation history." Through the neural interface, Sarah could sense Lieutenant Morrison's growing fatigue as he monitored aircraft systems while fighting against the violent turbulence. Behind him, Dr. Chun and the other engineers were showing signs of hypothermia. As the unheated cabin temperature continued to drop toward life-threatening levels. "Commander, we're starting to experience control system anomalies," Morrison reported. "The cold temperatures are affecting the experimental processors. I'm seeing intermittent failures in the flight control computers." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air temperature inside the X-47C. If the flight control computers failed, the inherently unstable aircraft would become uncontrollable within seconds. The experimental processors were the only thing keeping the powerless aircraft from entering a fatal spin dot. Dr. Kumar's voice came through the intercom with information that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Commander, the battery temperature sensors are showing critical readings. If the batteries get much colder, the chemical reactions will slow down and will lose power output even faster." Sarah realized they were caught in a death spiral of cascading failures. The cold temperatures were threatening both the flight control computers and the battery systems, while ice accumulation was degrading the aircraft's aerodynamic performance. They needed to reach the Ford's position before multiple system failures made the aircraft uncontrollable. "Ford Tower, this is X-47C declaring an emergency," Morrison transmitted. "We have multiple system failures in progress and require immediate landing clearance regardless of deck conditions." The Ford's air traffic controller came back with a response that carried the weight of military necessity. "X-47C, Ford Tower, will attempt to provide a landing opportunity during the eye-wall passage. Be advised that this landing attempt will be at the absolute limits of safety for both the aircraft and the ship." Sarah felt her hands shake inside the neural interface gloves as the magnitude of what they were attempting became clear. She would have one chance to land a powerless, unstable aircraft on a carrier deck that was moving through a 40-foot vertical range, while being battered by winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. The eye of Hurricane Elena was 35 minutes away, and 4 lives depended on a landing that had never been attempted in aviation history. The neural interface suddenly filled with alarms as Dr. Walsh's voice cut through Sarah's concentration with urgent precision. "Sarah, we're detecting an unauthorized signal attempting to infiltrate the X-47C's communication systems. Someone is trying to hack into the aircraft's control network." Sarah's consciousness remained locked on the X-47C's flight controls while her tactical awareness processed this new threat. Through the neural link, she could sense foreign electronic interference probing the aircraft's experimental systems, digital tentacles searching for vulnerabilities in the prototype's classified computer networks. "Dr. Chun," Sarah transmitted to the avionics specialist aboard the X-47C, "are you detecting any unauthorized access attempts on your engineering systems?" Chun's voice came back tense with alarm. "Commander, I'm seeing multiple intrusion attempts on our data networks. Someone is using very sophisticated electronic warfare techniques to penetrate our security protocols." Admiral Hawkins' voice crackled through the communication system from Miramar with information that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. "Sarah, an S of intercepts indicate that Chinese cyber warfare units are attempting to download the X-47C's experimental flight control software while the aircraft is still airborne." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If foreign intelligence services successfully penetrated X-47C's computer systems, they would gain access to decades of classified aviation research, even if the aircraft was successfully recovered. The prototype contained not just experimental hardware but revolutionary software algorithms that represented the future of military aviation. Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through the intercom with barely controlled panic. "Commander, our flight control computers are experiencing intermittent shutdowns. I can feel the aircraft becoming less responsive to control inputs." Through the neural interface, Sarah could sense the X-47C's experimental processors fighting a digital battle while simultaneously trying to maintain aircraft stability. The computer systems were being forced to defend against cyber attacks, while performing the critical function of keeping the inherently unstable aircraft from entering a fatal spin. Dr. Walsh approached Sarah's neural interface chair with a tablet displaying network security data. "Sarah, the cyber attacks are consuming processing power from the flight control computers. If the intrusion attempts continue, the aircraft stability systems could fail completely." Sarah made a command decision that would either save the aircraft or doom all 4 occupants. "Dr. Chun, I want you to completely isolate the flight control computers from all external communication networks. Cut off internet access, radio data links, everything except basic voice communications." "Commander, that will disable our navigation systems and weather data feeds," Chun replied. "We'll be flying blind except for basic instruments. Do it anyway. I can navigate using dead reckoning, but I can't fly an aircraft whose computers are being attacked by foreign hackers." Sarah's mental focus remained locked on the X-47C's control surfaces as hurricane winds continued their relentless assault. The moment Chun isolated the computer networks, Sarah felt the aircraft's response characteristics stabilize as the experimental processors returned to their primary function of maintaining flight control. But the isolation also meant they had lost access to weather radar data, GPS navigation updates, and communication with other aircraft in the area. Admiral Hawkins' voice came through the communication system with news that changed the entire tactical situation. "Sarah, intelligence reports indicate that Agent Rodriguez from the CIA has been providing classified information about this mission to foreign intelligence services. We believe he's been compromised for at least 6 months." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as memories of Agent Rodriguez flooded back. He had been present at every mission briefing, aware of every tactical decision, and positioned to know exactly when and where the X-47C would be most vulnerable. The cyber attacks weren't random attempts at electronic espionage. They were precisely targeted strikes based on inside intelligence. "Admiral, where is Agent Rodriguez now?" Sarah asked, her tactical awareness processing the implications of having a compromised intelligence officer with access to classified mission parameters. "Unknown. He disappeared from CIA headquarters approximately 2 hours ago, shortly after our mission briefing concluded." Admiral Hawkins paused. "Sarah, we have to assume that everything Rodriguez knew about this operation has been compromised." Through the neural interface, Sarah could sense foreign aircraft repositioning themselves around the X-47C's flight path. The Chinese and Russian reconnaissance planes were no longer maintaining standoff distances but were moving closer, their electronic warfare systems actively probing for weaknesses in the prototype's defensive capabilities. Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through the intercom with information that made Sarah's tactical situation even more desperate. "Commander, I'm detecting multiple surface contacts on our radar. It looks like foreign naval vessels are positioning themselves between our current position and the Ford's location." Sarah realized that Agent Rodriguez's betrayal had provided foreign intelligence services with complete information about the rescue operation. They knew exactly when the X-47C would attempt its carrier landing, and they were positioning military assets to intercept the aircraft if the landing attempt failed. Dr. Kumar's voice came through the intercom with a technical update that threatened to end the mission entirely. "Commander, the battery systems are showing critical temperature readings. The cold air temperature and electronic warfare countermeasures are draining power faster than our worst-case projections." Sarah felt the weight of cascading failures threatening to overwhelm her ability to maintain aircraft control. The batteries were failing due to cold temperatures. The flight control computers were under constant cyber attack. Ice was accumulating on the flight surfaces, and foreign military forces were positioning themselves to capture the aircraft if it survived long enough to attempt a landing. "Ford Tower, this is X-47C requesting immediate vector to final approach," Morrison transmitted. "We have multiple system failures in progress and may not have enough battery power to execute a standard carrier approach pattern." The Ford's air traffic controller came back with a response that carried the urgency of a life-or-death situation. "X-47C, Ford Tower, we're clearing all other aircraft from the area and preparing for emergency recovery procedures. Be advised that we're taking 40-foot seas and the flight deck is experiencing extreme motion." Through the neural interface, Sarah could see the Ford's massive bulk struggling against Hurricane Elena's fury. The carrier's flight deck was alternately buried under green water and thrust 30 feet into the air as waves larger than buildings crashed over the ship's bow. The arresting cables that would stop the X-47C were being stretched to their breaking points by the violent deck motion. Dr. Walsh's voice came through Sarah's helmet, communicator with information that changed everything. "Sarah, we've just received intelligence that Agent Rodriguez is aboard a Chinese submarine positioned along your approach route. They're planning to surface and attempt recovery operations if your carrier landing fails." Sarah felt her hands tremble inside the neural interface gloves as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Rodriguez hadn't just compromised the mission, he had positioned himself to personally oversee the capture of American military technology by foreign intelligence services. "Admiral, what are options if the carrier landing fails?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from studying the tactical situation. "Water landing in hurricane conditions with foreign military forces positioned for immediate recovery of the wreckage," Admiral Hawkins replied grimly. "Sarah, if you can't get that aircraft onto the Ford's deck, the technology aboard will fall into hostile hands, regardless of what happens to the crew." Through the neural interface, Sarah could sense the X-47C approaching the outer edge of Hurricane Elena's eye wall. The winds were beginning to shift direction as the aircraft entered the most violent part of the storm system, with gusts exceeding 160 miles per hour, creating aerodynamic forces that threatened to tear the experimental aircraft apart. "Lieutenant." Morrison's voice came through the intercom with the calm professionalism of a pilot who had accepted his fate. "Commander, whatever happens in the next 20 minutes, I want you to know that flying with you has been an honor." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized that Morrison was preparing for the possibility that none of them would survive. The next few minutes, through the neural interface, she could sense Dr. Chun and the other engineers huddled together in the freezing cabin, their brilliant minds reduced to the basic human need for warmth and companionship in the face of death. "Lieutenant, we're going to make it through this," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a conviction that came from 8 years of military aviation and a lifetime of refusing to accept defeat. The eye wall of Hurricane Elena reached out to embrace the X-47C. With winds that had never been survived by any aircraft in aviation history, the eye wall of Hurricane Elena struck the X-47C with the force of a freight train made of wind and ice. Through the neural interface, Sarah felt the aircraft structure flex beyond design limits as gusts exceeding 170 miles per hour hammered the prototype from every direction. The experimental flight control computers screamed digital warnings as aerodynamic Loads approached catastrophic failure thresholds. All stations, this is Ford Tower. The carrier's air traffic controller transmitted through static-filled communications. Hurricane Eyewall is passing over our position. Flight deck operations are suspended until further notice. Sarah's consciousness rode inside the X-47C as it was thrown through the sky like a leaf in a tornado. The aircraft pitched 90 degrees nose up, then rolled inverted as the hurricane's rotating winds seized control of the powerless prototype. Through the neural link, she could feel Lieutenant Morrison fighting against G-forces that pressed him deep into his ejection seat, while the 3 civilian engineers behind him struggled to remain conscious. "Commander, I'm losing control authority," Morrison reported. His voice strained as he fought against the violent motion. "The flight control computers can't compensate for these wind conditions." Sarah's hands moved instinctively inside the neural interface gloves, her mind commanding flight control surfaces that responded sluggishly to her mental inputs. The X-47C's experimental processors were operating at maximum capacity, making thousands of control adjustments per second just to prevent the aircraft from disintegrating in mid-air. Dr. Walsh monitored Sarah's vital signs from the control console. At Miramar, watching as her heart rate spiked to dangerous levels. "Sarah, your stress indicators are approaching critical thresholds. The neural interface isn't designed to handle this level of sensory input." "I need full connection," Sarah replied through gritted teeth, her consciousness locked in mortal combat with Hurricane Elena's fury. "If I reduce the interface sensitivity, I lose the ability to feel what the aircraft needs." Through the neural link, Sarah could sense the X-47C's battery systems fluctuating wildly as electrical demands exceeded design specifications. The experimental flight control computers were drawing massive amounts of power to maintain stability, while the aircraft's anti-ice system cycled continuously to prevent control surface freeze-up. Dr. Emily Chun's voice came through the intercom, barely audible over the howling wind noise penetrating the aircraft structure. "Commander, battery power is at 15% and dropping rapidly. The cold temperatures and high electrical demands are causing accelerated power drain." Sarah felt her stomach clench as she realized they had perhaps 10 minutes of flight control authority remaining. The mathematics were brutally simple. They would either reach the Ford's flight deck in the next few minutes, or the X-47C would become an uncontrollable glider falling toward the ocean. "Ford Tower, this is X-47C declaring emergency fuel state," Morrison transmitted, using aviation terminology that everyone understood meant they were out of options. "Request immediate clearance for emergency recovery, regardless of deck conditions." The Ford's air traffic controller came back with a response that carried the weight of desperation. "X-47C, Ford Tower, we're attempting to maintain course and speed for recovery operations, but we're taking green water over the flight deck every 30 seconds. Landing conditions are beyond all safety parameters." Through the neural interface, Sarah could see the Ford's massive bulk struggling against waves that dwarfed the 1,100-foot aircraft carrier. The ship's flight deck was alternately buried under cascading seawater and thrust 40 feet into the air as the hurricane drove waves the size of apartment buildings against the carrier's hull. Admiral Hawkins' voice crackled through the communication system from Miramar with intelligence that made the situation even more desperate. "Sarah, we're tracking Chinese and Russian surface vessels closing on the Ford's position. If the carrier landing fails, foreign forces will be in position to recover the wreckage within minutes." Sarah realized that Agent Rodriguez's betrayal had provided enemy intelligence services with complete tactical information about the rescue operation. They knew exactly when and where the X-47C would attempt its landing, and they had positioned military assets to capitalize on any failure. "Lieutenant Morrison, I need you to prepare for the most difficult carrier landing in aviation history," Sarah transmitted, her mental focus shifting to approach procedures that had never been attempted in hurricane conditions. I'm going to bring us in fast and steep to minimize our exposure time to the worst weather. Morrison's voice came back steady despite the circumstances. Commander, at what point do we consider ejection as an alternative? Sarah felt her heart skip as she considered the implications of that question. Ejecting into Hurricane Elena's eye wall would be instantly fatal, but it would also ensure that the X-47C's experimental technology was destroyed rather than captured by foreign forces. Ejection is not an option, Lieutenant. We're bringing this aircraft home. Sarah's voice carried the absolute conviction of someone who had never accepted defeat in 8 years of military aviation. Through the neural interface, Sarah could sense the Ford's approach lighting system struggling to remain operational as hurricane winds threatened to tear the equipment from the carrier's superstructure. The optical landing system that normally guided aircraft to safe landings was intermittently obscured by horizontal rain and flying debris. Dr. Kumar's voice came through the intercom with information that threatened to end the mission entirely. Commander, I'm detecting multiple system failures in the experimental processors. The hurricane conditions are causing electromagnetic interference that's disrupting the flight control computers. Sarah felt the X-47C's response characteristics changing as the experimental systems fought to maintain stability against forces they were never designed to handle. The aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control as computer processors failed and backup systems took over critical functions. Dr. Chun, can you manually override the failing processors and give me direct control of the primary flight surfaces? Sarah asked, knowing that manual control of an inherently unstable aircraft would require skills that existed at the very edge of human capability. Chun's voice came back tense with concentration. Commander, manual override will disable all computer-assisted stability augmentation. This aircraft will become nearly impossible to control without processor assistance. Sarah made the decision that would either save 4 lives or doom them all. Do it anyway. I'd rather fly an impossible aircraft than try to land with computer systems that are failing randomly. The moment Chun activated manual override, Sarah felt the X-47C's true nature through the neural interface. Without computer assistance, the experimental aircraft was a barely controllable flying machine that wanted to pitch, roll, and yaw in directions that defied aerodynamic logic. Every control input had to be precise and immediate, with no margin for error or hesitation. Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through the intercom with awe and terror. Commander, I can feel you controlling the aircraft directly through the neural interface. It's like watching someone wrestle with a wild animal. Through the neural link, Sarah could see the Ford's flight deck appearing through the hurricanes eye wall like a postage stamp floating on an angry ocean. The carrier was pitching through angles that would make a normal landing impossible, while the arresting cables stretched and snapped as waves crashed over the deck. Dr. Walsh's voice came through Sarah's helmet communicator with the final piece of information that would determine whether they lived or died. Sarah, you have approximately 3 minutes of battery power remaining. After that, the flight control systems will shut down completely. Sarah felt her hand steady inside the neural interface gloves as her military training took over. She had 3 minutes to accomplish what had never been done in aviation history: land a powerless, unstable experimental aircraft on a carrier deck in hurricane conditions, while foreign military forces waited to capture the wreckage if she failed. The Ford's flight deck rushed toward the X-47C at 150 miles per hour. The carrier's massive bulk rising and falling through a 40-foot vertical range as Hurricane Elena's fury reached its peak intensity. Sarah had one chance to get it right, and 4 lives depended on a landing that existed at the very limits of human possibility. The Ford's flight deck materialized through the hurricane's fury, like a narrow ribbon of salvation surrounded by chaos. Through the neural interface, Sarah could feel the X-47C descending toward the carrier at angles that defied every principle of safe aviation. The deck was rising and falling through a terrifying vertical range as waves the size of buildings crashed over the ship's bow, sending torrents of green water cascading across the landing area. 1 minute to touchdown, Sarah transmitted her consciousness locked in perfect harmony with the crippled aircraft. The neural interface had become seamless, her thoughts translating instantly into control surface movements as she fought to align the X-47C with the carrier's centerline. Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through the intercom with mechanical precision. Gear down, hook down, approach speed 130 knots. His training had taken over completely, running through landing procedures even though they both knew this approach violated every safety protocol ever written for carrier operations. The Ford's flight deck disappeared under a wall of seawater as another massive wave engulfed the forward section of the ship. Sarah held her breath as she waited for the deck to emerge, counting the seconds until the landing surface reappeared. When it did, the carrier had moved 30 feet to starboard and dropped 20 feet vertically. Battery power at 2%. Dr. Chun reported from her engineering station, her voice tight with controlled fear. Commander, we have maybe 60 seconds of flight control authority remaining. Through the neural interface, Sarah could feel the X-47C's flight control computers beginning to shut down non-essential systems to preserve power for the critical final seconds of the approach. The aircraft's response to her mental commands was becoming sluggish as processors went offline one by one. The Ford's optical landing system flickered through the horizontal rain, its lights barely visible through the wall of water and wind. Sarah ignored the traditional visual references and flew purely by instinct. Her consciousness merged with the aircraft's sensors as she judged the carrier's motion patterns. 30 seconds to touchdown, she transmitted, her mental focus narrowed to the precise moment when the X-47C's hook would need to engage the Ford's arresting cables. The timing had to be perfect too early, and they would miss the deck entirely. Too late, and they would crash into the carrier's superstructure. The Ford's deck rose toward them like an elevator platform. The arresting cable stretched taut across the landing area. Sarah could see deck personnel in survival suits clinging to safety equipment as hurricane winds threatened to sweep them overboard. The yellow-shirted flight deck officers were making frantic hand signals that were barely visible through the driving rain. Hook, 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 Morrison called out as the X-47C crossed the carrier's stern at precisely the moment the deck reached its highest point in the wave cycle. Sarah felt the aircraft's tailhook strike the steel deck with tremendous force, sending sparks cascading. Through the hurricane winds, the arresting cable engaged with a violence that threatened to tear the X-47C apart. Sarah felt the aircraft decelerate from 130 knots to 0 in less than 3 seconds, her consciousness experiencing G-forces that would have rendered her unconscious in physical reality. The experimental airframe groaned under stresses that exceeded every design specification, but held together as the prototype came to rest in the middle of the Ford's flight deck. "We're down," Morrison shouted over the intercom, his voice filled with disbelief. "Commander, we're actually on the deck." Through the neural interface, Sarah could sense deck personnel rushing toward the X-47C despite the hurricane conditions, their movements coordinated with the precision of sailors who had practiced emergency recovery procedures countless times. The aircraft was immediately secured with chains and chocks as another massive wave crashed over the carrier's bow. Dr. Walsh's voice came through Sarah's helmet, communicator with information that completed the picture of their success. "Sarah, all 4 occupants are alive and uninjured. You've just accomplished the most difficult carrier landing in aviation history." Sarah slumped back in the neural interface chair, her consciousness slowly returning to the hangar at Miramar as the connection to the X-47C was terminated. Her hands were shaking again, But this time it was from exhaustion and relief rather than her medical condition. Admiral Hawkins approached the pilot's chair with an expression of profound respect. "Sarah, I've been in naval aviation for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just accomplished. You saved 4 lives and prevented classified technology from falling into hostile hands." Through the hangar's windows, Sarah could see the first outer bands of Hurricane Elena reaching the California coast, bringing with them the same winds that had nearly destroyed the X-47C hours earlier. The storm's fury was a reminder of the natural forces that had nearly claimed 4 lives, and the human determination that had ultimately prevailed. "Admiral, what's the status of Agent Rodriguez and the foreign naval forces?" Sarah asked her, tactical awareness still processing the larger implications of the mission. "Rodriguez has been arrested by Navy security forces aboard the Chinese submarine. The foreign vessels withdrew from the area once it became clear that the recovery operation was successful," Admiral Hawkins replied. "Your landing eliminated their opportunity to capture the prototype aircraft." Sarah looked down at her hands, noting that the tremor was barely perceptible. The neural interface technology had given her back something she thought she'd lost forever: the ability to fly at the very limits of human capability. But more importantly, it had reminded her of who she was underneath the trauma and self-doubt. "Ma'am, will there be other opportunities to use this technology?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from the expression on Admiral Hawkins' face. "Sarah, after what you've accomplished today, I think we can find a place for the Navy's most gifted pilot, regardless of any physical limitations you might have." Admiral Hawkins smiled. "Welcome back to active duty, Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez." The college girl who had walked into Hangar 7 that morning was gone, replaced by the pilot who had always existed beneath the surface, waiting for the chance to prove that sometimes the most dangerous limitations are the ones we place on ourselves. 3 weeks after the hurricane landing, Sarah Rodriguez sat in her restored office aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, reviewing mission reports that carried classification levels she hadn't seen since her active duty years. The neural interface technology had been declared a revolutionary success, and she found herself at the center of a new aviation program that would reshape military flight operations for decades to come. Her hands moved steadily across the keyboard as she typed her after-action report, the tremor barely noticeable as she documented the technical aspects of the X-47C recovery. The medical board had officially cleared her for full flight status, noting that the neural interface system had proven that physical limitations need not define operational capability. But Sarah knew the real breakthrough hadn't been technological. It had been learning to work with her condition rather than against it. Dr. Jennifer Walsh knocked on the office door, carrying a tablet displaying data from the latest neural interface test flights. "Sarah, we've had remarkable success integrating the NFIS technology with conventional aircraft. Pilots with various physical limitations are achieving performance levels that exceed their pre-injury capabilities." Sarah looked up from her reports, noting the excitement in Dr. Walsh's eyes. The neural interface program had evolved beyond emergency applications to become a tool for expanding human potential rather than simply compensating for limitations. "How many pilots are currently qualified on the system?" 12, with another 30 in various stages of training, Dr. Walsh replied, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "The technology is creating opportunities for aviators who thought their careers were over due to injury or medical conditions." The implications were staggering. Thousands of experienced military pilots had been forced into early retirement due to conditions similar to Sarah's. The neural interface technology could return their expertise to active service, while simultaneously enhancing their capabilities beyond normal human limits. Sarah's secure phone rang with the distinctive tone reserved for admiral-level communications. She answered with the crisp professionalism that had become second nature after returning to active duty. "Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez." "Sarah, this is Admiral Morrison." The voice belonged to her former mentor, the man whose son she had helped save during the hurricane landing. "I have a situation that requires your specific expertise with the neural interface system." Sarah felt her pulse quicken at the familiar tone of urgency in Admiral Morrison's voice. "What kind of situation, sir?" 20 minutes ago, a prototype stealth aircraft experienced complete electrical failure during a test flight over the Arctic Ocean. The pilot and 2 engineers aboard have approximately 4 hours before hypothermia becomes fatal. "Admiral." Morrison paused. "Sarah, the aircraft is carrying technology that makes the X-47C look primitive by comparison." Sarah stood up from her desk, her mind automatically shifting into tactical planning mode. "Sir, what are the environmental conditions?" "At the crash site?" "Blizzard conditions with visibility near zero, temperatures at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds gusting to 60 miles per hour. The nearest airfield is 800 miles away across pack ice that's breaking up due to climate change." Sarah realized that Admiral Morrison was describing a rescue scenario that made the hurricane landing look straightforward by comparison. Arctic conditions would create unique challenges for the neural interface system, while the remote location would limit support options if the technology failed. "Admiral, what's the aircraft type and current status?" Sarah asked, already moving toward her flight gear locker. "Classified prototype designated Aurora 7, designed for reconnaissance operations in denied airspace. The pilot is Major Rebecca Torres, one of our most experienced test pilots, but she's never attempted a landing on pack ice without engine power." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic conditions they would be facing. Landing any aircraft on unstable pack ice required skills that existed at the very edge of aviation possibility. Attempting it with a powerless prototype aircraft would push both technology and human capability into uncharted territory. "Sir, I'll need complete technical specifications for the Aurora 7 and real-time weather data from the crash site," Sarah said, her professional instincts taking over completely. "Also, I want Dr. Walsh and her entire neural interface team standing by for immediate deployment." Admiral Morrison's voice carried a note of relief mixed with apprehension. "Sarah, there's one more complication you should know about. Satellite imagery shows Russian military forces moving toward the crash site. If we don't recover that aircraft within the next 6 hours, its technology will fall into hostile hands." Sarah stopped moving, her tactical awareness processing the implications of another international incident involving experimental aviation technology. The pattern was becoming clear. American prototype aircraft were being targeted by foreign intelligence services who had learned to exploit emergency situations for technological gain. "Admiral, do we have intelligence suggesting this electrical failure was caused by sabotage rather than mechanical problems?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer from the timing and circumstances. "That's classified information, but Sarah, I want you to assume that hostile forces are actively working to capture this technology. Your mission is to recover the aircraft and personnel before that happens." Sarah looked out her office window at the calm Pacific Ocean, knowing that in a few hours she would be using the neural interface system to pilot an aircraft through Arctic conditions that had never been survived in aviation history. The college girl who had once sat in lecture halls seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a pilot who had learned that the most dangerous missions were often the ones that defined who you really were. "Sir, I'll be ready for deployment in 30 minutes, Sarah said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had discovered that limitations were often just opportunities in disguise. "Outstanding, Sarah. And Sarah, bring Major Torres home safely. Her father is waiting for news." The secure line went dead, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of another impossible mission and the knowledge that 3 lives were depending on technology that had been tested exactly once, under conditions that had nearly killed everyone involved. She reached for her flight helmet, noting that her hands were completely steady as she prepared for another journey to the very limits of human possibility. The neural interface helmet felt familiar now as Sarah settled into the pilot's chair aboard the emergency response aircraft racing toward the Arctic Ocean. Through the aircraft's windows, she could see the transition from temperate Pacific waters to the frozen wasteland where Major Rebecca Torres and her crew were fighting for survival in temperatures that could kill within minutes of exposure. Dr. Walsh worked frantically to calibrate the neural interface system for Arctic conditions, her fingers flying across control panels as she adapted the technology for an environment it had never been designed to handle. Sarah, the extreme cold is going to affect the neural transmission protocols. We're essentially beta testing the system under the worst possible conditions. Story of my life, Sarah replied, watching the Arctic landscape scroll past beneath them. Ice floes stretched to the horizon like a broken white puzzle, with leads of dark water opening and closing as ocean currents shifted the massive ice sheets. Somewhere in that frozen wilderness, 3 people were waiting for rescue that might never come. Admiral Morrison's voice crackled through the communication system with updated intelligence from the crash site. Sarah, we've established radio contact with Major Torres. The Aurora 7 is intact but powerless, sitting on an ice floe that's approximately 2 miles wide and drifting toward open water. Sarah felt her stomach clench as she processed the tactical situation. Landing on a drifting ice floe would require not just precision flying but also perfect timing as the improvised runway moved through the Arctic Ocean. If she misjudged the approach, the aircraft would either crash into the ice or overshoot into the frigid water. Admiral, what's the thickness of the ice where they're located? Sarah asked, her mind calculating the structural loads that would be imposed when a multi-ton aircraft landed on frozen seawater. Estimated at 4 feet, which should be sufficient to support the Aurora 7's weight if the landing is executed properly, Admiral Morrison replied. But Sarah, the ice is showing stress fractures that could cause the floe to break apart during landing operations. Through the aircraft's advanced weather radar, Sarah could see the storm system surrounding the crash site. Arctic blizzards created visibility conditions that made instrument flying nearly impossible, while wind shears caused by temperature differentials could flip aircraft inverted without warning. Dr. Walsh completed the neural interface calibration and turned to Sarah with an expression that mixed professional confidence with personal concern. The system is adapted for Arctic conditions, but we're operating beyond all tested parameters. If the neural link fails during your approach, Major Torres and her crew will die along with decades of classified technology. Sarah nodded grimly, understanding that failure would have consequences far beyond the loss of 3 lives. The Aurora 7 represented aviation technology that was years ahead of anything currently deployed, and its capture by hostile forces would compromise American military aviation for decades. Beginning neural interface connection, Dr. Walsh announced, activating the primary systems. Sarah, you should start receiving telemetry from the Aurora 7 in approximately 60 seconds. Sarah's consciousness expanded across 800 miles of Arctic wasteland as the neural link established connection with the powerless prototype aircraft. Through the Aurora 7's sensors, she could feel the brutal cold that had already begun affecting the aircraft's control systems, while ice crystals formed on every internal surface. Major Rebecca Torres sat in the pilot's seat, her breath visible in the sub-zero cockpit as she monitored what remained of the aircraft's failing electrical systems. Behind her, 2 civilian engineers huddled together for warmth, their survival depending entirely on Sarah's ability to execute an impossible landing on shifting pack ice. Major Torres, this is Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, establishing remote pilot authority, Sarah transmitted through the neural interface. I'm going to bring you home. Torres' voice came back steady despite the desperate circumstances. Commander, we've been monitoring your approach. The ice floe is drifting toward a lead of open water. We estimate 30 minutes before our landing site becomes unavailable. Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as impossible odds crystallized into a specific tactical challenge. She had 30 minutes to fly a powerless aircraft across 800 miles of Arctic wilderness and land it on a moving ice floe before it drifted into water that would be instantly fatal for all occupants. Major, I need you to activate the Aurora 7's emergency power systems and prepare for immediate takeoff, Sarah commanded, her consciousness merging with the experimental aircraft's control systems. Commander, we don't have engine power. How can we possibly take off from pack ice? Torres asked, confusion evident in her voice. Sarah smiled as she realized that the neural interface technology offered possibilities that conventional aviation had never imagined. Major, who said anything about using engines? Through the neural link, Sarah began commanding the Aurora 7's experimental flight control surfaces, using the Arctic wind patterns to generate lift without conventional propulsion. The prototype aircraft began moving across the ice floe like a massive glider, gathering speed as hurricane-force Arctic winds caught its advanced wing design. Impossible, Torres breathed as she felt the aircraft becoming airborne without engine power. Commander, you're flying this aircraft using nothing but wind energy. Sarah's consciousness rode the Aurora 7 through Arctic wind patterns that would have destroyed conventional aircraft, using the storm's fury as a source of power rather than an obstacle to overcome. The neural interface allowed her to feel every wind current and pressure differential, turning the hostile environment into a navigation tool. 3 hours later, the Aurora 7 touched down safely at Thule Air Base in Greenland, its occupants alive and the classified technology secure. Major Torres and her engineers were treated for hypothermia but would make full recoveries, while the prototype aircraft provided invaluable data about cold weather operations. Sarah removed the neural interface helmet in the Arctic rescue facility, her hands steady as she documented another impossible mission successfully completed. Through the facility's windows, she could see the northern lights dancing across the polar sky, a natural display that reminded her of the beauty that existed even in the world's most hostile environments. Dr. Walsh approached with a tablet displaying performance data from the Arctic rescue. Sarah, you've just proven that the neural interface technology can operate under any environmental conditions. This opens possibilities we never imagined. Admiral Morrison's voice came through the secure communication system with news that would change Sarah's life once again. Sarah, the President has personally reviewed your service record and the neural interface program's success rate. You're being promoted to commander and assigned as the director of the new Advanced Aviation Recovery Division. Sarah felt the weight of new responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar uniform. The tremor that had once ended her career had become the foundation for a new type of military aviation that pushed human capability beyond all previous limits. Admiral, I accept the assignment, Sarah said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned that the most dangerous limitations were often the ones that existed only in the mind. The girl they had called just a college student had become the pilot who redefined what was possible when human determination met advanced technology. And in a world where the impossible happened daily, Sarah Rodriguez had proven that sometimes the best pilots were the ones everyone underestimated. What incredible feat of aviation would you attempt if technology could bypass your physical limitations? The Neural Interface Program is expanding globally, and pilots like Sarah Rodriguez are proving every day that human potential has no boundaries when we refuse to accept defeat. If this story of determination and breakthrough technology inspired you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest tales of impossible achievements. What type of story would you like to see next? A surgeon who operates with robotic precision despite trembling hands. An athlete who breaks world records using advanced prosthetics? Let us know in the comments below. Remember, the most extraordinary people are often the ones who look perfectly ordinary until the moment they prove that limitations exist only in our minds.